creating variables. Variables, similar to the other areas that we were looking at, also have a context to them. There are the flow var context, the session var context, and the record var context. Similar to our other expressions we've seen, variables can also be accessed through dot notation, and oftentimes when variables are accessing map data, it's once again preferred to use that bracket notation you saw earlier.
We have a couple processors that are going to allow us to set different types of variables. One is the variable transformer. This sets or removes flow variables. These are the variables that are tied to the message event as it moves through flows. We can reference these with MMUULLEE expressions such as flow vars dot and then the name or key of the variable. On the other side, there are session variable transformers. This lets us set or remove session variables. Now, session variables are also tied to the message event as it moves through flows, but they are persisted across some, but not all, transport barriers. So there's a few transport barriers that will serialize and deserialize session variables and send them across the transport. They can also be referenced by MMUULLEE expression language using the syntax session vars dot and then the key, such as foobar.
Variable persistence. Now that we've seen properties both inbound and outbound, two types of variables, sessions and flows, what does the persistence look like? Well, the inbound scope, as we learned, is going to be set on the message source. So theoretically, those inbound properties are available before the message enters MMUULLEE, but once they hit that message source, they become part of the inbound properties or inbound scope. And then those inbound properties are available for all the subsequent message processors. Until another endpoint or transport comes along, those inbound properties aren't going to persist themselves or transfer outside of that transport. Flow variables, on the other hand, are set once you have a message processor in place that adds that specific variable. And those variables stay local to that message's event. As the message moves through different processors, that variable is going to follow it. But if that message crosses a transport barrier, the flow var, similar to the inbound property, is not going to leave the actual MMUULLEE runtime. The outbound scope, on the other hand, is going to leave. So just like flow variables, you can set them anywhere inside of message processors, but when you hit a transport, especially ones like HTTP or JMS, that outbound property will become metadata, some type of header information that will leave with the message payload. And then lastly, the session variable scope, which will persist potentially across all of these boundaries. But the caveat with session variables is it requires you to be using some type of specific transport that supports the notion of session variables. Most commonly, you'll see these used when you need to persist a variable along different VM queues, a transport that you'll learn about later in class. Next up, let's see if we can read and write some of our own variables and walk through 5.4. We'll use the variable transformer to create a flow variable, use a session transformer to create a session variable, and use the MMUULLEE debugger to see their values. Let's get started. Back in Anypoint Studio, let's add a flow variable to our flow. So to do this, we'll type in variable in the MMUULLEE palette. We can then take the variable transformer and drag that right after the property transformer in our flow. We can select the variable transformer, and similar to a property, we can set the variable. For this variable, let's set it as QP type. And let's set the value to an expression where we grab that query parameter type and capture it as a flow var. So we'll do message dot, again, this will be inbound properties, and this will be the HTTP query params. And we'll specifically ask for the type query parameter. All right, so now we've got our flow var of type grabbed inside of here. Let's go to our logger and make sure that we can log not just the outbound property QP name, but the variable QP type. So if we go back to the variable, again, this is QP type, go back to the logger and try to log this out. So inside of here, we'll label these so they're easier to see. We'll call this first one name : with our expression. Then the second one we can say type : and put a new expression in. Now for this expression, instead of accessing the message context, we are going to access the flow vars context. And if we hit dot on the flow vars context, DataSense has picked up the variable before this logger, and we can select the QP type variable that we have inside of here. All right, so in this case, let's make sure that we have a breakpoint on the set payload transformer. Let's save our application up, and let's run this application in debug mode. You may be prompted once again to switch perspectives. In this case, we'll hit yes. And let's go to Postman and make another request. Now in Postman, we want to make sure we're calling hello, but also that we're specifying a name and a type as query parameters. Let's hit send. Once we've hit send, we can go back to Anypoint Studio, and in Anypoint Studio, we can start walking through. So let's use our step icon here to move over set payload, over our property. And now let's select this variables tab. Right now, since we're on top of variables, it hasn't triggered. So when we step over it to the logger, we should see the QP type variable show up. So let's go next to the QP type variable. And here we can see QP type has been set as a variable. Now again, this is local to the MMUULLEE application, specifically to the event that this message is moving through with. So when we respond back to our HTTP client, we shouldn't actually see this variable persist as a header. If I step forward again, we'll move over our logger. We could quickly check the console and verify in the console that both the name and the type are being printed out correctly inside of our logs. And if we go back to Postman, we can see that our outbound property is persisting on, our payload is persisting on, but that flow variable, again, never leaves the MMUULLEE runtime. All right, back inside of Anypoint Studio, let's make a couple more changes. Along with the flow variable, I'd like to set a session variable. To do this, let's go back to the MMUULLEE design mode. And in the MMUULLEE design mode, let's add a session variable right after the flow variable that we're setting inside of here. We'll double click on the session variable and we'll set a session variable. In this case, we'll keep it very simple. We'll put the name as color and the value will be gray. And then in our logger, let's go ahead and print out the session variable as well. So we'll double click on the logger. At the end of type with our expression, let's put in color, and then set up another expression. This time, we are going to use session vars inside. And using our dot, again, DataSense will pick up what values we have for session vars, and I'm going to choose color inside of here. All right, so let's save up the project. If it's still running in debug mode, you should see that the console will recycle and the application will redeploy. Once it has successfully redeployed, let's go back to Postman and let's make a request again. Once the request is made, we'll return back to Anypoint Studio. You may have been prompted to switch perspectives again if you had switched out of debug like myself, which it's okay to hit yes here. All right, and now we'll step through. Now go to the debugger tab. And in this case, I know that the step option is F6, so I'm going to use F6 on my keyboard. Feel free to use that keyboard shortcut as well as you step through in class. So I'll do F6 to move over the property, then to the variable, then on top of the session variable. So now I can see the variable is inside of here. In the session scope, we can see that's also blank at this point. But if we step one more, we can now see gray show up inside now that we've stepped over the session var. So very similar to flow vars, except session vars have the ability to cross over some specific transports. Now let's see if it crosses over HTTP. So if I hit the next arrow again to send the response back, we can go back to our console and we can see that the outbound property, the flow variable, and the session variable are all printing out in our log. Let's go back to Postman. And inside of Postman, you can see that the outbound property is persisting, the body is persisting, but there's no sign of our session or flow variables. Now again, session variables are typically not used in MMUULLEE applications. They only have very, very specific use cases, like if you need to persist a variable across a VM queue. HTTP is a great example where if you had a session variable, HTTP as a transport still doesn't respect the notion of a session variable. It's not the same as what people often refer to as an HTTP session. A session variable is more specific to what MMUULLEE considers a session to be. So in this case, the flow variable and the session variable will not come back to our client. All right, let's go back to AnyPoint Studio, make sure we stop the project, and let's wrap up this module.